In the extreme northern latitudes of the European continent, there exists a landmass defined by brutal absolute silence and the crushing weight of profound geographical isolation. This is a territory where ancient, unyielding granite bedrock fractures beneath the freezing, steel-colored waters of the Baltic Sea. For months on end, the sun completely abandons the sky, leaving the land submerged in a perpetual, freezing twilight, where temperatures plunge to bone-chilling depths. Yet, against this backdrop of harsh, unforgiving natural hostility, human life does not merely survive, but operates with a mesmerizing clockwork precision. We are looking at Sweden, a vast expanse where over 70% of the surface is swallowed by dense, impenetrable primeval forests, silently guarding nearly 100,000 glacial lakes. From the flat, wind-battered agricultural plains of Skåne in the deep south, up through the dense, dark timberlands of the heartland, the terrain eventually surrenders to the majestic, lethal Arctic tundra of Lapland. This extreme northern frontier is the ancestral domain of the indigenous Sami people, who have endured the wrath of the Arctic Circle for millennia. To exist here is to be entirely at the mercy of the Earth's violent orbital tilt. In the brief, hallucinatory peak of summer, the landscape is bathed in an ethereal, relentless daylight that aggressively suspends the natural passage of time, refusing to let the horizon darken. But as the Earth pivots, the long winter inevitably descends, coating the world in a low, slanted, liquid gold light that provides virtually no physical warmth. This immense, crushing vastness of the natural world has forced the national psyche to evolve a profound, almost genetic appreciation for extreme physical space, absolute quiet, and deep emotional solitude. In this environment, silence is never perceived as an awkward emptiness, but rather as a heavily weighted, necessary survival mechanism. To understand the mechanics of this society, one must meticulously observe how the deep, menacing calm of the natural world dictates the steady, highly regulated pulse of modern progression. This is the documented reality of human existence within one of the quietest, most internally regulated nations on the surface of the planet. The daily biological and social rhythm of the population is heavily dictated by a strict, non-negotiable demand for order, high predictability, and an obsessive preservation of personal physical boundaries. Whether insulated within the highly engineered, minimalist concrete apartments of central Stockholm, or sheltered behind the iconic iron oxide red-painted wooden facades of remote suburban settlements, the physical home serves as a literal fortress against the elements. When the external environment plunges into extended darkness and freezing moisture, the interior living space must function as a meticulously curated refuge. The biological need for thermal and psychological security has driven the population to construct their environments using simple, highly functional natural materials like dense timber and heat-retaining stone. To counteract the severe lack of natural solar radiation, interiors are strategically saturated with the soft, ambient, low-temperature glow of electrical lamps and raw candle flames. Because urban density forces a large percentage of the population into multi-story apartment complexes, they have engineered a unique, hyper-structured system of communal housing cooperatives known as bostadsrätt. This legal and social framework forces a shared, highly regulated sense of financial ownership and strictly monitored collective responsibility. The most visceral manifestation of this extreme social regulation is found in the depths of the residential buildings within the communal laundry facility known as the Privatstuga. This windowless utilitarian space operates on a rigid, heavily enforced mechanical booking system that tolerates zero deviation. The precise protocols for chemical usage, machine operation, and floor sanitation are followed with an almost religious, unspoken compliance. Leaving fibrous lint trapped inside the exhaust filter of a drying machine is not a mere oversight, but is categorized socially as a severe, unforgivable transgression against the collective order. The Tivatstuga functions as a highly pressurized microcosm of the entire national operating system, proving that efficiency is only maintained through mutual, silent adherence to a master set of rules. This intense, hyper-vigilant respect for boundaries extends directly out of the basement and into the freezing streets of the public sphere. Social interactions in uncontrolled environments are deliberately suppressed, remaining profoundly calm, heavily reserved, and strictly transactional. Initiating unsolicited verbal communication with an unknown individual while standing at an exposed public bus stop is considered a highly irregular, socially disruptive anomaly. Instead, human bodies physically arrange themselves in a precise, evenly distributed geometric pattern along the pavement, enforcing a wide, measurable buffer zone of empty air between each person. This physical distancing is a calculated, environmentally adapted behavior designed to protect the individual's mental bandwidth and conserve social energy during periods of intense climatic stress. Yet, directly beneath this hardened, frozen social exterior operates a powerful, invisible infrastructure of collective mutual dependency. The entire structural integrity of the nation is built upon a foundational, unshakable doctrine of absolute social equality, locally defined as jamliket. This doctrine requires a massive, continuous psychological investment of blind trust directed toward the centralized government, toward bureaucratic public institutions, and toward the invisible strangers surrounding them. The evidence of this trust is strictly observable in the mechanics of their daily, repetitive physical routines. Human masses align themselves into perfectly linear, patient queues without the need for physical barriers or armed enforcement. Household biological and synthetic waste is not simply discarded, but meticulously washed, categorized, and separated into multiple distinct chemical recycling streams with robotic precision. The traditional vertical hierarchies of power and dominance have been systematically dismantled and flattened out of existence. Since a massive linguistic and cultural overhaul enacted in the 1960s, the standard protocol for verbal engagement demands that everyone, from the highest-ranking corporate executive to the most prestigious academic professor, must be addressed explicitly by their given first name. This deliberate removal of formal titles strips away the artificial layers of authority, enforcing a stark, unavoidable egalitarian reality upon every human interaction. To prevent this highly engineered, maximum efficiency social machine from psychological collapse, the population relies on a mandatory, rigorously scheduled pressure release mechanism known as fika. To the uninitiated external observer, this phenomenon appears to be a basic, localized consumption of hot, caffeinated liquid accompanied by a simple, sugar-infused carbohydrate-baked good, most commonly a cinnamon-laced pastry. However, this biochemical intake is actually a deeply entrenched, institutionalized social verb. It is a non-negotiable fracture in the timeline of the working day, a moment deliberately carved out to force the cessation of all physical and mental labor. Inside the sterile, high-pressure environments of global corporate headquarters, this ritual is legally mandated, serving as an informal, low-stakes arena for psychological stabilization and silent team calibration. By forcing human bodies to pause, sit together, and consume hot calories in unison, the society actively diffuses hidden tensions and builds a silent consensus before conflict can physically manifest. It is a heavily calculated, government-sanctioned deployment of relaxation, scientifically acknowledged as the critical fuel source required to sustain their staggering levels of national productivity. The national identity is deeply anchored to a strict chronological calendar of biological and botanical events, dictated entirely by the severe shifting of the planetary axis. The most critical of these survival rituals manifests during the astronomical peak of the summer solstice, known locally as midsummer. As the northern hemisphere tilts maximally toward the sun, the landmass is subjected to a relentless, unyielding bombardment of solar radiation, resulting in the longest daylight period of the year. To metabolize this sudden, overwhelming abundance of light, the population migrates outward from urban concrete centers into the dense, green periphery of the countryside. This gathering is a calculated, almost pagan recalibration of the human spirit after enduring the crushing psychological weight of the winter darkness. The ceremonial consumption of calories is strictly codified. The population ingests a highly specific, traditional menu consisting of raw herring chemically preserved in acidic vinegar, freshly excavated early harvest potatoes heavily seasoned with pungent green dill, and dense, lipid-rich sour cream. This is immediately followed by the ingestion of the first naturally ripened red strawberries of the brief agricultural season coated in thick dairy cream. The auditory environment is simultaneously saturated with loud, rhythmic, traditional, alcoholic drinking chants, classified as Snapsvisor. Physical bodies synchronize in circular, repetitive dance patterns around a towering vertical wooden axis known as the maypole, a structure meticulously bound with freshly harvested green birch leaves and fragile wild botanical specimens. It is a mass, synchronized biological release, a necessary communal venting of repressed energy before the planetary tilt inevitably reverses. Conversely, when the Earth's orbit plunges the territory back into the absolute depths of winter darkness, the society deploys a counter-ritual to artificially manufacture warmth and psychological hope. On the exact morning of December 13th, when the absence of natural photons is most deeply felt, the frozen infrastructure of towns and cities is systematically illuminated by organized human processions. This is the Festival of Lucia. The visual focal point is a designated young female draped entirely in a floor-length, unblemished white gown, physically bearing a heavy, precarious crown of raw, burning wax candles directly upon her head. In the pitch-black corridors of schools, industrial workplaces, and private residences, she functions as a literal and metaphorical heat source. She is shadowed by a synchronized vocal choir projecting traditional acoustic frequencies meant to stimulate auditory comfort. This highly orchestrated visual and auditory display is accompanied by the precise consumption of lusicata, dense baked carbohydrates heavily saturated with the chemical compound of yellow saffron, alongside rigid, brittle, heavily spiced ginger biscuits known as pepperkakor. It is a solemn, highly structured atmospheric intervention engineered to visually promise the population that the solar cycle will eventually return. This rigid adherence to seasonal consumption continues into late August, where the population organizes kraftskivor, localized aquatic harvesting events where masses of boiled, red-shelled freshwater crayfish are consumed under the artificial glow of fragile paper lanterns. Later, to mark the pre-Lenten period of Shrove Tuesday, they consume semlor, heavily fortified baked spheres of cardamom-spiced dough, hollowed out and packed with dense caloric almond paste and towering layers of whipped dairy fat. These edible rituals are not random. They provide a vital, predictable chronological framework that anchors the human mind against the disorienting, extreme fluctuations of the Nordic climate. The psychological architecture holding this entire societal structure intact is an untranslatable, deeply ingrained linguistic philosophy known as lagom. Operating as the master algorithm of the Swedish mindset, it loosely translates to the pursuit of the exact, appropriate quantity. It is the active, deliberate rejection of both excessive accumulation and severe deprivation. Lagom is the relentless pursuit of the optimal, sustainable baseline. This algorithmic preference for moderation is physically visible in the sparse, hyper-efficient geometry of their architectural design, in the slow, methodical extraction of consensus within corporate boardrooms, and in the deliberate suppression of aggressive, individualistic self-promotion. It is a silent, omnipresent behavioral code that forces the biological unit to prioritize the long-term survival and stability of the collective over the chaotic, short-term ambitions of the individual ego. This doctrine of balanced moderation has engineered a highly unorthodox, yet terrifyingly efficient, national economy. The financial infrastructure operates as a hybrid machine, merging a high-velocity, technologically advanced capitalist engine with a massive, state-managed biological welfare safety net. The territory serves as the global headquarters for heavy, precision manufacturing and complex industrial engineering, while the capital city of Stockholm functions as a hyper-dense incubator for advanced digital software and telecommunications, statistically categorized as a factory for billion-dollar startup valuations. Yet, the biological human labor fueling this economic machinery is fiercely protected by rigid operational parameters. The legally enforced standard for human exertion is strictly capped at 40 hours per week. The expenditure of energy beyond this limit, commonly known as overtime, is statistically rare and socially discouraged. Within this behavioral framework, an individual remaining at a workstation into the late evening hours is not perceived as demonstrating superior dedication, but rather as exhibiting a critical failure in logical time management. This strict boundary between economic labor and biological recovery is financially guaranteed by an immense, heavily centralized social support apparatus, historically referred to as folkhemmet, or the home of the people. Through the systematic extraction of high taxation from the populace, the central government mechanism redistributes these resources to guarantee comprehensive biological maintenance. It provides universal, heavily subsidized medical interventions, totally free academic instruction from early cognitive development through advanced university research, and a vast, complex network of financial safety nets. It is a highly engineered, cradle-to-grave security protocol designed to completely eliminate the primal human fear of destitution. Industrial conflicts are systematically neutralized not through aggressive confrontation, but through calculated, highly structured negotiations between powerful trade unions and corporate employer organizations, ensuring the continuous, uninterrupted flow of societal progress. The most radical application of this collective security algorithm is observed in the state's intervention in human reproduction and infant development. Upon the biological creation of a new citizen, the state forcibly disrupts the economic labor cycle by legally entitling the parental units to 480 days of fully compensated absence from the workforce. To forcibly engineer a balanced societal structure, a significant block of this time, exactly 90 days, is non-transferable and strictly allocated to the male biological parent. The implementation of these localized papamonada, or daddy months, has physically altered the demographic landscape of urban environments. On any given Tuesday afternoon, the public infrastructure of parks and pedestrian walkways is heavily populated by adult males mechanically pushing insulated, wheeled infant transport devices. This state-mandated alteration of traditional gender mechanics ensures a symmetrical distribution of domestic labor and forces the creation of deep, foundational, psychological bonds between both creators and the newly formed biological unit during its most critical, highly neuroplastic developmental window. It is a system built on the cold, calculated, and ultimately correct assertion that a psychologically secure and equitably balanced population is the most potent fuel for long-term national prosperity. To survive the brutal, prolonged caloric deficit imposed by the freezing environment, the indigenous culinary architecture, strictly defined as Husman's kost, functions less as an art form and more as a calculated biological defense mechanism. This dietary system is heavily engineered around dense, hypercaloric preservation. The absolute pinnacle of this survival diet is the traditional Swedish meatball. This is not merely ground animal protein, it is a dense, heavily seasoned sphere of sustenance, submerged in a thick, lipid-rich brown gravy, historically designed to insulate the human body against extreme temperature drops. To cut through the overwhelming fat content, the dish is aggressively countered with the sharp, acidic burst of wild lingonberries, small, bright red spheres of tartness meticulously hand-foraged from the damp, shaded floors of the pine forests, alongside slices of highly preserved, vinegar-soaked cucumber. Another caloric anchor is the mandatory Thursday consumption of thick, yellow pea soup heavily fortified with cured pork, immediately followed by dense pan-fried batter cakes. This specific Thursday protocol is a rigid biological habit hardwired into the population since the pre-Reformation era, originally designed to stockpile bodily energy reserves before the mandatory Friday religious fasting. Because the landmass is fractured by thousands of freezing freshwater lakes and surrounded by the brutal Baltic Sea, aquatic protein is harvested with industrial precision. The silver-scaled herring is not simply cooked, it is violently cured and submerged in heavily spiced, acidic, and sucrose-heavy chemical marinades, ensuring it remains edible through the darkest, most barren months of the year. Pink-fleshed salmon is similarly preserved through the ancient method of gravadlax, where the raw muscle tissue is buried under heavy weights and chemically burned by a thick crust of coarse sodium chloride, processed sugar, and pungent green dill. In the modern era, this obsessive need for structured consumption has mutated into a bizarre yet strictly observed weekly ritual known as Fredagsmys, or Friday coziness. As the working week terminates, millions of family units retreat into their insulated dwellings to collectively consume highly localized, modified versions of Mexican tacos, effectively using the repetitive assembly of seasoned ground meat and crisp carbohydrate shells as a psychological trigger to initiate the weekend relaxation protocol. Daily caloric intake is further stabilized by the omnipresent knäckebröd, a severely dehydrated, brittle rye cracker. The act of shattering this dry disk and coating it in thick, yellow dairy butter provides a consistent, reliable texture that has fueled the population for centuries. To truly dissect the Swedish psychological operating system, one must observe their terrifying, almost symbiotic dependency on the raw, untamed wilderness. The outdoor environment is not treated as a temporary recreational facility. It is categorized as a vital, spiritual extension of their own biology. This primal connection is legally codified into the national constitution through an ancient, untouchable doctrine known as allemansrätten, the absolute right of public access. This legal framework grants every single biological unit the unrestricted freedom to traverse privately owned forests, scale granite mountains, and harvest wild botanical matter across the entire landmass. The only cost of this ultimate freedom is an unspoken, aggressively enforced code of absolute non-disturbance. The human must move through the environment like a ghost, leaving zero physical trace of their existence. When the brief summer thermal window opens, a massive, synchronized migration occurs. Urban centers are abruptly drained of human life as millions retreat to their stuga. Small, primitive, deliberately under-engineered wooden cabins, violently painted in a highly specific, toxic-looking iron oxide red. These structures are intentionally isolated, often clinging to the rocky perimeters of the Stockholm archipelago, a fragmented, chaotic spray of over 30,000 islands. Within these wooden boxes, the population actively initiates a brutal technological regression. They strip away the insulation of modern convenience, intentionally plunging their bodies into freezing, black lake waters, silently extracting predatory perch from the depths, and suspending themselves in canvas hammocks under the hallucinatory, endless twilight. It is a necessary, calculated detoxification from the immense pressure of their highly structured society. Farther north, in the lethal expanses of Lapland, the interaction with nature becomes even more extreme. Here, the sky itself frequently detonates into silent, magnetic radiation storms known as the aurora borealis, casting violent, ghostly green and violent ribbons of light across the frozen, deadly tundra. The human entity here is reduced to absolute insignificance, a fact the population actively seeks out as a form of profound psychological grounding. Yet, running entirely parallel to this primitive natural worship is a terrifyingly advanced, hyper-connected technological infrastructure. The vast, empty distances between human settlements are bridged by a relentless, highly engineered network of steel railways and electrified public transit. The subterranean Stockholm metro system, the tunnelbana, is brutally carved directly into the ancient bedrock of the earth, its cavernous, exposed stone walls blasted with aggressive, colourful artistic installations, effectively functioning as a massive, habitable subterranean bunker. Above ground, the societal operating system is completely obsessed with environmental optimization. Bicycles are not leisure tools. They are aggressively deployed, primary mechanical transport vehicles navigating massive, dedicated asphalt arteries in freezing conditions. The psychological guilt of atmospheric pollution has even manifested into a localized psychological condition known as flygskam, or flight shame, actively pressuring the population to abandon air travel. Furthermore, physical currency has been entirely eradicated. Paper money and metal coins are effectively obsolete artifacts. The entire society operates on a frictionless, invisible digital grid. Every citizen is biologically tied to a secure, centralized digital identification matrix known as Bank ID. Every transaction, from the transfer of millions of kroner to the purchase of a single warm cinnamon bun, is executed through silent, invisible, encrypted data packets traversing the frozen air. It is a society that has successfully engineered a way to live entirely in the future, while simultaneously keeping its hands buried deep within the freezing ancient soil of the past. The intellectual infrastructure of the nation is treated with the same rigorous, uncompromising engineering as its physical highways and subterranean transit networks. The state perceives the raw, undeveloped human cognitive network as its absolute most valuable natural resource, investing heavily to ensure it operates at maximum, uninterrupted capacity. From the earliest stages of infant neural development to the highest tiers of complex, globally competitive university research, the extraction of knowledge is completely subsidized by the central government. Within the ancient, freezing stone corridors of historically dominant academic fortresses like the universities of Uppsala and Lund, the pedagogical doctrine has been radically weaponized. Traditional, passive rote memorization has been entirely eradicated from the curriculum. In its place, the educational machinery forcefully instills aggressive, critical analysis, lateral problem-solving, and a deeply ingrained instinct for collaborative consensus. Young biological units are systematically trained to question authority, to dismantle established protocols, and to construct their own independent, highly logical, operational frameworks. This intense period of cognitive conditioning culminates in a violent, highly visible societal rupture known as the Studenten. Upon the termination of their secondary education, thousands of adolescent units don stark, identical white naval-style caps. They are then loaded into the exposed cargo beds of massive, heavy-duty diesel transport trucks, physically parading through the normally silent and highly regulated urban grids, projecting deafening, chaotic acoustic frequencies across the city blocks. Following this massive, synchronized discharge of energy, the state actively encourages geographical displacement. A vast percentage of the youth undergoes a mandatory gap year, launching themselves across the globe to absorb foreign data. Alternative societal structures and raw survival experiences before eventually being pulled back by the invisible gravity of their homeland to integrate their newly acquired data into the national economic engine. The biological rhythm of this society is entirely hostage to the brutal, extreme rotation of the planet. Because of the extreme northern latitude, the human eye is subjected to an optical tyranny of severe contrasts. During the brief, heavily regulated daytime hours, the urban machinery operates with chilling, unhurried efficiency. The physical movement of bodies through the transit networks, the extraction of labor in corporate environments, and the exchange of digital capital all proceed with a steady, calculated, almost mechanical precision. But as the earth tilts away from the sun and the long, crushing winter descends, the external environment becomes profoundly hostile. The sudden, absolute absence of photonic radiation initiates a massive, nationwide psychological defense protocol known as MISE. This is not a passive state of comfort. It is a desperate, highly calculated cultivation of artificial warmth designed to combat the encroaching psychological void. Within the hermetically sealed environments of their concrete and timber dwellings, the population actively manipulates their microclimates. They ignite raw, combustible wax wicks to generate localized, low-temperature thermal pockets. They physically insulate their biological forms beneath dense, heavy woven textiles, and they systematically ingest near-boiling, heavily spiced liquids. This deliberate domestic retreat is a survival mechanism, a forced hibernation of the soul against the deadly temperatures outside. Conversely, when the planetary axis shifts toward the summer solstice, the environment mutates into a state of manic, over-illuminated suspension. During the white nights, the solar disk merely scrapes the horizon, refusing to plunge the land into true darkness. The population reacts with altered, prolonged behavioral patterns. They congregate in exposed public spaces, near the edges of the freezing water, actively absorbing the lingering, ghostly twilight, their circadian rhythms deliberately fractured to harvest every possible fraction of light before the inevitable darkness returns. However, this seemingly flawless, hyper-calibrated social machinery operates under immense internal and external friction. The utopian facade is continuously battered by the sheer, brutal reality of the physical environment. The prolonged absence of solar radiation for months on end inflicts severe, measurable damage upon the human neurochemical balance, leading to widespread psychological fatigue and a heavy, unspoken, melancholic weight that saturates the population. To sustain the colossal state-run welfare apparatus, the population is subjected to a crushing regime of capital extraction. The financial gravity required to secure basic biological necessities, thermal shelter, localized caloric intake, and heavily regulated chemically induced depressants like ethanol is staggeringly high, forcing the human unit to operate at peak economic efficiency just to maintain their baseline existence. Furthermore, the foundational psychological algorithm of lagom harbors a dark, intensely oppressive shadow protocol known as Jantelagen, or the law of Jante. This is an invisible, ruthlessly enforced, and deeply terrifying behavioral code that actively suppresses individual ambition. It is a silent, social execution of the ego, punishing any unit that attempts to elevate itself, display excessive confidence, or break away from the established collective median. Beyond the psychological and financial pressures, the ancient, deeply rooted homogeneity of the Nordic population has recently collided with a massive, sudden influx of global displacement. Driven by a legally codified historical adherence to extreme humanitarian values, the state machinery has absorbed vast numbers of immigrants and refugees fleeing war and climatic destruction in the southern hemispheres. This massive demographic injection has violently fractured the traditional, uniform societal landscape, creating a complex, highly volatile, multicultural reality. The sheer velocity of this integration process has caused severe operational failures within the social matrix, resulting in the physical and economic isolation of new populations. Invisible, impenetrable sociological borders have rapidly formed around suburban concrete enclaves, leading to a localized breakdown of the overarching social trust. This unprecedented friction has forced the nation into a painful, highly polarized, and ongoing psychological recalibration. The native population is now engaged in a desperate, real-time calculation, struggling to balance the preservation of their ancient, silent, and highly structured cultural identity with the chaotic, unavoidable reality of an inclusive, globally integrated future. Faced with these mounting internal pressures, extreme climatic hostility, and heavy economic extraction, a logical query emerges. Why does the human population voluntarily choose to remain anchored to these specific, frozen coordinates on the globe? When presented with a theoretical endless array of global alternatives, why do they root their existence in this quiet, brutally cold, northern territory? The answers are not located in grand, theatrical, ideological statements, but are deeply embedded in the microscopic, highly dependable mechanics of their everyday survival. They remain fundamentally because of an invisible, heavily engineered psychological shield known locally as trigit. This term translates to a profound, almost aggressive state of absolute safety and existential security. It is the complete eradication of urban paranoia. In this environment, a human entity possesses the unparalleled freedom to physically navigate through unlit, isolated urban grids or dense, freezing forest peripheries at any hour of the planetary rotation, completely devoid of the primal biological fear of predation or violence. The cortisol levels of the population remain remarkably stable because the threat environment has been systematically neutralized by the collective. This safety is fueled by another even more powerful invisible resource, tillit, or absolute social trust. Statistically measured as the highest concentration of mutual reliability on the planet, tillit is the foundational operating system of the entire nation. It is the deeply programmed, non-negotiable belief that both the vast bureaucratic institutions and the completely unknown biological strangers sharing the pavement are, by default, inherently trustworthy and operating with benevolent intentions. This staggering level of trust eliminates the immense daily friction and psychological stress that paralyzes other global societies. The most shocking, visceral manifestation of this phenomenon is observable outside local thermal consumption centers, cafes. Here, maternal and paternal units routinely and voluntarily abandon their highly vulnerable, newly generated offspring. Infants are left outside, deeply insulated within wheeled transport devices, exposed to the freezing ambient air, while the parents retreat behind thick glass to consume hot liquids. To the external observer, this appears as terrifying negligence. Within the matrix of Swedish society, it is the ultimate, undeniable proof of a successfully functioning, perfectly secure, collective ecosystem. Furthermore, they remain anchored here to maintain their critical, symbiotic umbilical cord to the raw, natural world. The ability to instantly detach from the hyper-connected digital grid and vanish into the absolute, crushing silence of the ancient pine forests, or to drift among the thousands of isolated granite islands of the archipelago, is not categorized as a mere recreational luxury. It is a strictly enforced biological necessity. The human nervous system here requires regular, intense doses of sensory deprivation provided by the wilderness to flush out the toxic accumulation of modern stress. It is a profound grounding mechanism, a literal physical reset switch located just minutes from the dense urban centers. Ultimately, the population endures the darkness and the cold for the promise of absolute balance. They have collectively engineered a culture that vehemently rejects the globalized narrative of perpetual, exhausting labor. They possess the radical understanding that the extraction of economic value is merely a fraction of human existence, and that the deliberate allocation of time for biological family units, for isolated psychological recovery, and for quiet, internal reflection is the true metric of a successful civilization. They stay for the steady, deeply predictable rhythm of the changing seasons, a relentless cosmic clock that enforces a deeper, more meaningful connection to the earth, to the local community, and to the fragile architecture of the self. This territory exists in a state of carefully negotiated, razor-thin equilibrium. It is a society suspended perfectly between the crushing, ancient solitude of its glacial landscapes and the hyper-efficient, collective strength of its modern welfare state. It is a biological population shaped equally by the silent, towering forests and the violent, freezing sea, heavily moulded by the dramatic, severe fluctuations between blinding solar radiation and absolute, suffocating darkness. The result is a quiet, highly resilient and deeply analytical collective consciousness. Within these borders, the value of human life is not measured by deafening noise, chaotic spectacle, or the aggressive accumulation of individual dominance. Instead, it is calibrated by the steady, dependable pulse of the seasonal cycles, the profound thermal warmth generated by a shared, silent moment of consensus, and the stark, undeniable beauty of an existence engineered for total equilibrium. As this journey concludes, the raw reality of this northern frontier stands as a monumental, living testament. It proves that in a global ecosystem rapidly tearing itself apart with artificial acceleration and sensory overload, there remains an absolute, primal human requirement for a society that chooses a quiet, deliberate